Hello everyone, Xeno What If here. Bring in second movie of What If Lupin the Third meets the mercenary clan. Link down description of the fanfiction of this What If. Listen here YouTube. I do not own anything and this is not a scam. Act 2 Chapter 1 The Black Notebook. Somewhere of a funeral or a group of people. However, one of them, being Albert, was also there. However, somewhere in a bar, was discussing with a man about something about a black notebook. However, Lupin had to disguise himself as Fujiko for his time being while also getting information as well. Which is able to find a secret entrance. And inside, a door, and I was able to scan, which is able to have both fingerprints and the eye similarity to the guy he seduced as. And when the door opened, there was a lot of rare stuff in it. Well, would you look at that? This stash should be easily as much as $1 million. To be honest, I see many tinier junkyards. Jigen said. The guy buys every single piece of art just because he owns it, but once he has, he loses interest. So he hoards all of this incredible treasure like this. However, Lupin explained that picture he gave to Jacob is actually created by Gaston, which was also decided to put on Picasso's name on it. Which he decided to put on under his calling. That's a calling card. However, the next day, police arrive at the scene. However, the DGES, a man known as Albert also notices they entered some kind of shopkeeper's first place. However, a secret underground place. However, a group of men in black were also following Lupin and Jigen, which they decided to run in separate directions. Lupin throw the pot plant directly at one of the men in black suit. However, the other one had a gun pointing directly at Lupin, which had no choice but to. However, only for Jigen to came in and gun hit him in the head, pistol left in the back. However, Lupin know that these guys were not actually police officers, but also part of the GGFC. However, Lupin decided to call in the chairman. However, what he didn't realize that the whole cafe had a bunch of undercover agents pointing their guns directly at him. However, what they didn't realize that wasn't actually Lupin. Instead, it was actually Chicken. As he used the phone as a flash grenade. However, as the chief of the GBC entered a car what was inside the painting was actually the black notebook as the real Lupin. The third was actually pointing his Walter P38 directly onto the chief of DGES. However, only for it to faint when the moment fired a gunshot. However, Jigen and Lupin were actually at another bar where someone was stripping. However, this black notebook hides a lot of affairs, including a lot of criminal records with many police officers. Back in the office where Albert was working on some stuff, also known as the director. However, with Lupin and Jigen in a trolley cart, heading towards the place. However, was more concerned, seeing that he was gone full on religion on him or something. Well, I don't know why Gaston give me this black notebook, Lupin said. Well, but I look on your face. But I'm guessing that God knows at this point, Jigen said, as the trains took them to the place. As I asked them to however, Lupin was kinda confusing that he met Gaston some time ago. As they finally made it to Gaston's grave, was also thinking that, did he really meet Gaston's ghost? However, he got the book, but he noticed that it also has the name Albert. Who is Albert? Jigen said. Yeah. He's the last guy the first ever deal with again, Lupin said. Seeing that he knew who Albert was, somebody close. Act 2 Chapter 2 An old acquaintance. However, Lupin thought it was actually him, but instead, point the gun at someone else. They were having a bit of a drink of bar. However, Lupin knew that when the moment he gets the phone, he knows that exactly it wasn't Gaston, but he said someone else on the other side of the phone. Turns out to be Albert. As one of outside the bar, a group of men, 3 individuals. However, unknown individuals are opening fire on the. However, it wasn't actual L that was actually in pursuit of them, but someone else by the name of Jose as the car chase went on. However, somewhere else in a wonderful area, Gomon tried to only for him to actually, comedically break it. However, a person in a mask stops them. However, it wasn't a person that was attacking them was actually some he or she with a mask. However, not also the weapon was more like baton and also a shotgun mixed together. However, the guy with them shot the first only for the fell down. However, the man that told the information to Lupin actually passed away. However, Lupin looked up at the skies, realizing now is the time to see the last guy he ever saw again. And as they put on disguises with Sound Blaster in a new vehicle form disguise, guys, as there have been many checkpoints with police officers. I analyzed the security. That seems too easy, Sound Blaster said in his vehicle form. Yeah, I agree with the Cybertronian, Jigen said. Then we should graciously accept the invitation, Lupin said. This is just a trap and luring in Node app better. Jigen said. And you know that I'll use this trap to get the better opportunity on this guy, as they continue driving as however, Lupin said. As Lupin was able to disguise itself as one of a police officer girl. With Albert. Albert followed the coordinates. As Albert made it to where the bridge is both Lupin and Albert meet for the first time. You know, I was wondering why exactly did you have gave me all the trouble to steal this? Lupin said, hardly. Dirty jobs are always handled by dirty rats like yourself. When you say, Albert said, which really pissed off Lupin, pride. You haven't changed at all. That out of your two things up. You think I'll just hand this little guy over to you? Said Lupin said, smugly, only for Albert to pull a pistol from his jacket to point it directly at Lupin. Well, I could always take it from you by force. Albert said, so death is so dirty. Someone else isn't. Yeah, I'm sure that your hands really must be dirty. Clean. Why would shooting a thief dirtying my hands? Albert said when he pulled the trigger. However, Lupin felt the pain. As Albert shot him again as the notebook fell from his hand. Like, I had to get payback for roping me in mess, rest. But it's that attitude. I always have valid reason for shooting in the gut, heart. Would you like to know why? As Albert walked closer to Lupin, now still kneeling and bleeding. Because I want to just see you in despair because I won. As Albert walked up to the notebook and picked it up, Lupin had one last trick of his because he plants a bomb in his car when he pulled the trigger. However, instead of the bomb exploding the car, it ended up in the river, which shocked him even more. I noticed by now, toss that present that you rigged my car with, river, Albert said mockingly as Lupin fell on the ground unconscious from the blood loss. Act 2 Chapter 3 An Unlikely Alliance. On the bridge of Paris, Lupin was lifeless. However, he was still alive. Albert was descent. However, he saw a jet with Sound Blaster in robot form. However, he realized that his bullets did not do nothing as Sound Blaster fired his energon weapon directly at him as warning shots. As he got down the bridge, he checked on Lupin, which he know he was still breathing and alive. Sound Blaster looked directly at Albert, willing to kill him, but not as he grabbed Lupin directly on the vehicle form of Afterburner that was flying off. However, with Albert, he knew that he had new allies. However, proof of unknown assailants attacked him, which Albert had no choice but to jump off the bridge. However, all they needed was the black notebook. With Lupin on the other hand, he remembered going through his childhood, his life as a master thief. However, no matter what, Albert was always one step ahead of him in some abandoned warehouse far away in the wilderness in an abandoned harbored area, looking woken up from all his past memories he had. With the cold sweat he had on his face. Well, it seems you're finally awake, Sabretooth said. The minicon of Sound Blaster was able to see him still alive. Well, thanks to my medical for organics, it was able to pay off pretty well. Double Crosser said. The two-headed mercenary of the group said, thank you, I guess. Yes. But at least take it easy for a time being, said. How long will they out? Lupin said. 2 or maybe 3 days, Jigen said. Preparing dinner. I'm sorry, man, Lupin said, as Gomon was able to get something. However, turned out to be a snake, which has almost scared the living crap out of Jigen, which Sabretooth couldn't help but laugh. However, the person with the mask known as Revenant was alive and was able to make it to the hideout. Someone thought that he or she was dead. However, Joey, the leader of the group, gave her a punishment, shocking her. Was she still alive? Then again, with Lupin and those new allies of his Cybertronian or whatever, alien friends of his, could be quite a bit of a problem, Joey said. No kidding. Normally, I would enjoy devouring and ripping their metal to pieces. Cassie said, then we'll move on to the next phase. Back with Lupin. As we're enjoying the meal, apparently, this Albert person really must be getting underneath your skin. Am I correct, Lupin? Sound Blaster said as he stopped eating. Lupin knew where this was going. Hey, come on now, Sound Blaster, Jigen said. You were even calling your name in your sleep, Sabretooth said. He was the one who abandoned Lupin. Lupin said with venom. Remember. As you remembered another memory of him parting ways with each other. However, there has been news reports of terrorist groups. However, even news about this terrorist attack happened including across even amongst other GPD. However, people thinks that the Black Notebook was more like Pandora's box. As another terrorist attack also happened again. As unknown Sale and started attacking as is both Lupin, Jigen, and Gomon left the apartment as Lupin throw a grenade. However, when they were driving, the motorcycle vehicle form of Nightbird, which turned out to be the same masked individual, Reverend was ready to fight against Gomon. However, only for another individual that had the ability of metal strings got on To Nightbird. Vehicle form, sending them flying as they made it to a construction yard. However, came across, fighting against the Cassie who had metal sharp teeth and claws, which Lupin's kind of freaked out by this as Jigen and Nightbird came in to save. As they finally made it back to their hideout at the abandoned harbor in the woods. These individuals are rather dangerous. Sound Blaster said. Well, I was able to get some communications online. And judging from the network that these people are responsible for these terrorist attacks, especially for that election as well. Seems rather kind of sketchy if you ask me. Splicer said. Yeah, and we don't even have the Dan No notebook anymore, Jigen said. Yeah, meaning, Albert does not even have it as well, Nightbird said. Buzzer, have you able to get any report of Albert that he has a notebook? Sound Blaster said to Buzzer, his mini-con partner. No, Bach, I haven't. Bach, when I was able to spy on him, he doesn't have the notebook. It seems that he might already someone else must have had it already. Bach Buzzer, the bird, mini-con of Sound Blaster said. As another speech was happening, however, the Prime Minister will also make a deal with the thugs. Lower. Sovereign. As many of the Prime Minister and secretaries, especially the GBD, also had a bit of a discussion. However, Albert knew that Prime Minister scum, even he had a flashback during World War with him and Lupin as young teenagers. However, when he was asleep, he decided to put on his old black jacket. Take out the glasses with his old gun. And with his car. However, he always thinks France is his, always for taking no one else, not even Lupin as he made it to the GB chief's place. However, the chief of GBT was actually tied up, which Lupin was able to manage to make it first. Lupin, Albert said. Well then, score. It must have were so riled up. Do something about it. You'll always be a thief no matter where you'll end up in life, won't you? I already told you. The only reason I became a cop is to go a much bigger target. And what brings you here? Me. Just thought I asked our mutual friend here, the past that been surrounding me lately, that our interests align nicely. Well, then I'll leave the interrogation in your cable hands. Albert, what the hell do you think you're doing? I think you get away only for the cheek to be scared like a little pussy. As Albert has serious look. I'm the one who's asked to hear Albert's in a dark look on his face. Act 2 Chapter 4 Going Our Separate Ways. At the Chief DGES house area, Albert was able to get some answers while interrogating the damn bastard for actually causing some terrorist attacks. However, which Albert, we've got a noise for Lupton actually. Come with him seeing that the Lupin said, not exactly need a bit of a helping hand as Albert and Lupin were driving. As Lupin told about exactly an incident that happened about saving Albert from some kind of leopard creature in New Mexico. However, as they were about to argue, they were being chased by 3 black fans with men. However, with Bug Bite, Splicer, and alongside Sound Blaster in the vehicle forms using their energon weapons in battle mode of vehicle form, blasting it. However, Gomon and Jigen decided to take care of stragglers while Nightbird and in our new sports car vehicle form with Sound Blaster also following. Seeing that Jose was behind us. As Nightbird transformed and kicked Cassie out in the face, sending her flying. Oh, I'm going to enjoy spilling your energon blood all over its Cybertronian, she said, what a menacing look. Nightbird in her robot form as a ninja pointed her blade directly at Cassie. I am more of a cyber-chonian ninja who fights with honor unlike you. Nightbird said, then show me what you got. That sound blaster in his vehicle form, ejected. His mini-con bird buzzer flying, but also supporting aerial support while also getting out Sabretooth, the cat-like feline cassette minicon of Sound Blaster, killing off many of Jose's mercenary men. As Lupin dork grenade, killing off many of the goons. As Joseph didn't care for his men as Revenant was ready to kill Lupin. However, with Nightbird and Cassidy, Nightbird was able to kill her with her inner John blades once and for all in half. Unlike you, Organic, I do not fight like a ferocious animal. She looked up at the castle. Sound Blaster, Lupin, make sure that you're okay, she said. As Lupin got some nunchucks. However, he was able to trap Revenant in some kind of torturing chamber area. Revenant was completely dead this time. However, Lupin finally gets to meet Jose, ironed a weapon. However, Jose was able to be killed by taking care of Final Lupin. However, Jose was willing to die seeing he put a bomb in his body. However, luckily for both Lupin and Albert, they were able to survive, which Lupin decided to give back the black notebook to Albert as they finally made it on the bridge, which Lupin decided to give Albert a fake one, which he couldn't help but laugh, as he had to walk and throw the notebook away. However, news reports about Prime Minister doing some terrorist scandal put on a bit of a bad edge vibe. As Lupin couldn't care much, but as well, seeing that Lupin and Albert might actually come again sometime in the future. But who knows? And this is the end of the second movie. Do not forget to leave a comment down below and subscribe to the channel.